It's my pleasure that Dana Mahr from the University of Geneva is joining us. It's the second session today with a focus on health policy, and the intersection of health science and policy making. And we'll return to this topic at least twice more throughout the lecture series. More precisely, what Dana is going to talk about today is what she's termed depersonalized health, and she'll explain what this term means. Rethinking AI medicine, public participation, and biomedical research. Now, let me very briefly introduce Dana. Dana is a senior researcher with the ERC SNF research group, Rethinking Public Participation and Science at the University of Geneva. In addition, she also leads the project Sense Making and Personalized Health within the SNF Synergy Project Development of Personalized Health in Switzerland. And Dana's research, I'm sort of reading this off your web profile, Dana, centers on how common people, in scare quotes, make sense out of science, technology, and medicine. So it's focus on sort of user, customer, patient, and technology interaction. She's also interested in different modes of knowledge co-production between science, medicine, and the public, such as citizen science, open science, and do-it-yourself technologies, health technologies, more precisely. And I'm also reading this off your web profile, Dana, and maybe you can tell us more in due course if you'd like to. It says you're currently busy writing the manuscript of your second book, if that is still the case, which will explore how the rise of Web 2.0 applications and health data sharing networks influence self-help practices of women. Okay, so without further ado, over to you, Dana. We'll have an hour or so, maybe presentation, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. Thank you, Dana, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Lucas, for the kind introduction and for inviting me. So you just showed to me that I have to maybe update it because right now I'm writing my fourth book, so it's not quite up to date. So the book was already out at the beginning, was already in the Prograve Macmillan program. Yeah, in this series. A pivot series published in late 2020. So
thank you. Sorry, tells you
no, not a problem. I need to update this. So thank you for the kind introduction. Okay, in the middle of 2020, during a morning shower, I felt a lump in my right breast. Concerned as I'm a transgender person on estrogen, I visited my gynecologist. He could not determine the condition of my breast and referred me to the university hospital. A few days later, despite the COVID-19 pandemic, I received an appointment in the oncology department of the University Hospital of Geneva. The treatment included blood tests, the collection of my medical history, a biopsy, and a genetic test, because there are some family-related issues. The doctor explained to me with pride in his voice that he wanted to feed my case into a brand new AI system for an optimal diagnosis and respective personalized treatment. Inspired by his enthusiasm, I began to fill out the consensus materials and handed them back to him. Only a few days later, I received a call from him. The enthusiasm had disappeared from his voice. Inwardly, I prepared myself for the worst case scenario. Oh God, Dana, you might have breast cancer. He explained to me in an occupied voice that people like me were not compatible with artificial intelligence. Hastily, he added, but there is good news from the biopsy. The tumor is benign. With relief in my heart, I said goodbye to him. It was only a few minutes later that I began to think about his first sentence and thought, why am I not compatible with their AI? After some reading about the algorithm used by the hospital, I began to understand that my identity as a transgender person is a glitch in digital medicine. Since then, my interest in the topic of digital biases has been intensified. I've read various academic papers and gathered the experiences with AI medicine of both my non-European and my LGBTQIA+ friends. From a more epistemological point of view, my question is and was, how can we study the emergence and or mitigation of algorithmic biases empirically? The topic of digital biases has become omnipresent in the public consciousness during recent years. Job search ads for highly paid positions are less likely to be presented to women on LinkedIn. Online searches for distinctively Black-sounding names are more likely to display arrest records. Image searches for professors in the hard sciences produce fewer images of women. Facial recognition systems increasingly used by the police perform worse on recognizes faces of women, Black and brown individuals. Natural language processing algorithms encode language in gendered ways. And even gadgets like chatbots are prone to biases and hate speech, since they learn from their interactions with human actors. A more current example for this is the Korean chat AI Luda. Luda, like so many deviant AIs, both in reality and fiction, was meant to impersonate the character of a young woman, in this case specifically that of a 20-year-old college student. Already 1 month after her implementation into Korean social media, Luda began to react problematic. When asked about its opinion on lesbians, she replied, "I hate them, they are creepy." When asked about Black people, she was saying, in the same way, racist stuff, and even at some time, Hitler did nothing wrong. So the discussion about technology amplifying human biases is increasingly accompanied by studies from social scientists. Yet many of these studies do not explore the internal sociality of algorithms, machine learning, or AIs, but rather predominantly focus their social consequences. Some blame this on the intellectual copyright of many algorithms, while others stress that they cannot study algorithms because their internal workings resemble a black box, as Ziad Obermeyer from Berkeley argues in a recent article in Science. Yet, even well-known representatives of the science and technology studies are rather dismissive. Harry Collins, for example, rejected in his 2018 book to study the sociality of AIs because, in his view, they would merely reproduce the social role of the individual. The thinking about whether artificial intelligence can or should be a subject of sociological inquiry is almost as old as the first lines of code themselves. Artificial intelligence was already a hot topic during the 1980s. Post-Kuhnian sociologists such as Bruno Latour and Stephen Woolgar are publicly seen as pioneers in this field. In analogy to the social nature of scientific knowledge, it would soon become necessary, so Woolgar, to study the inherent role of AIs in the making and reproduction of a society's fabric. As you can see in the quote displayed on this slide, This would be not a burden, but rather an opportunity for sociologists, and it would enable us to re-evaluate our own preconceptions about behavior and human agency. Although it may seem so, thinking about the sociology of algorithms is not just a topic for middle-aged white cis men. A pioneering position in this respect was taken by Madeleine Eckrich, who developed the basic features of the actor network theory as early as 1987. In particular, her concept of social scripts in technical objects is groundbreaking for an empirical investigation of algorithmic sociality. Such scripts, as the displayed quote shows, incorporate a society's vision for itself. Yet, as system theorists like Niklas Luhmann might have said, they could also preserve and reproduce implicitly its worst tendencies. This Janus-facedness of technical and digital objects was pointedly expressed by the postmodern feminist Donna Haraway. The catchphrase of her 1990s Cyborg Manifesto was, some of you might know, technology is not neutral. But voices like Eckrich and Haraway's have fallen silent since the 2000s. So too has the work of feminist epistemologists. In parallel, computer science also became increasingly gendered. Queer programmers, non-white and female programmers gave way to a vision of a cold and analytical, ultimately male idea of the internal working of algorithms. This masculine epistemology of the digital world continues to resonate today, and with it the problem of digital biases. A local example of this is Geneva's University Hospital's handling of its new medical AI. The acquisition of the AI IBM Watson for Genomics for 85 million Swiss francs was celebrated by the hospital's oncologists and bioinformaticians, as well as the local and even European press, as an investment into the digital future. In an interview, Rodolphe Meyer, the hospital's chief informatics officer, told us that the use of Watson ultimately would personalize and streamline cancer treatment. Furthermore, it would set medicine free from human biases, like quantification, graphs, or statistics. The use of a medical AI is framed and used as a technology of distance and by proxy objectivity. With datasets that I obtained from the Federal Office of Public Health, publicly available statistics, and via the open source data community Kaggle, I began to study in winter 2020 the training process of the Watson Cancer Genomics AI a little bit more in detail. Among the used datasets were, among others, 9 Swiss population cancer registries and the National Cancer Statistics. With the help of an Azure machine learning sandbox toolkit, I cross-validated, together with one of our IT officers, this material and compared it to the population statistics of Geneva. The outcome of this pilot inquiry showed that about 92% of the AI training data stems from predominantly Caucasian Swiss and EU citizens. Yet, the currently available in-house data of the AI contains health information of 13.6% of non-European users. This correlates with the current non-foreigner statistics of the city. My preliminary assessment of this is the following. The AI's capability to assess specific genetic environmental and cultural health characteristics of non-European patients might be reduced due to biased and non-context sensitive training data. This in turn may lead to less optimized literature reports and treatment recommendations by the AI in clinical practice. Since the AI assesses individual patient data sets, also against the backdrop of both the PubMed and the Genome-Wide Association study database, the possibility for bias mitigation might even be higher. As you can see in the blue parts of these two pie charts from a 2019 study on diversity in genome studies, such databases are predominantly composed of information derived from people with European heritage. The omission of race or ethnicity as input variable in most Swiss training data and also most European training data is yet another source for potential bias, since it blinds the AI to Geneva's patients' diversity. Accordingly, I identified 3 sources for bias in the use of medical AI in Switzerland: the underrepresentation of minority data in international repositories, the non-context sensitive training data, and the ambivalence toward ethnicity as input variable. This might especially be harmful for the Asian communities of our city in Geneva, since many forms of cancer have different gene expressions in these populations. While genetic forms of breast cancer in Caucasian women predominantly involve mutations on the genes BRCA1 and BRCA2, Asian women are more susceptible to defects on the genes ESR1 and NRIP1. These risk loci are less represented in both the training and referential data of the Watson AI. I'm currently discussing the topic with both the Geneva University Bioinformatics Department and oncologists in Switzerland and Germany. While IBM proposed to use their own toolkit to mitigate such biases, both hospitals and policymakers seek to utilize a more local and participative approach. The reasons for this are problems with algorithmic forms of bias mitigation that actually raise new equity concerns. The European Cardiovascular Disease Risk Assessment Model's bias mitigation adds, for example, extra points to internal risk score rankings for people of European heritage, which leads to a lower risk score for non-white patients. This might then lead to the use of fewer clinical resources for these patients. Let us have with this slide a closer look into the knowledge actor network describing the function of the Watson AI. Basically, as you can see, the standard model for the function of the AI positions medical experts as decision makers. If you have a look at the green square, which represents human actors in this representation, you see that they are being informed by the output of the AI and then make decisions that generate 2 forms of information. This information then will be processed by the AI. On the one hand, clinical activities that can be directly integrated into the data repository of the algorithm. On the other hand, nodes in human language that are translated into data via natural language processing. Comparing these in-house generated data with the international genome database PubMed information and its training data, the algorithm then adds a new set of internal experiential pathways and ultimately gives slightly altered recommendations for practical interventions. Ultimately, according to its epistemic rationale, outcomes of such a circular or spiral process will lead to better predictions and recommendations, so the thinking behind it. Yet, due to the aforementioned bias sources in the training and reference data, this process runs the risk of reproducing the biases ingrained into the information used for learning. A possible way to mitigate this kind of bias in a local and participative way, centered around intelligent social augmentation, by reintegrating human actors that are emergent concerned into different stages of the AI learning process. This involves the integration of minority populations into the decision-making regarding clinical activities, as well as the evaluation and correction of input information. Both involve deliberative processes with members of minority populations as lay experts, medical experts, and the programmers or designers handling a local AI. To design such an approach towards social AI augmentation, the Federal Office of Public Health will invite Swiss and German hospital stakeholders, members of the Swiss data science clusters in Lausanne and Zurich, the SciTech from Bielefeld University, knowledgeable representatives of local Asian minorities, and myself to take part in 3 focus groups over the course of 2023 and 2024. Due to the virus, we had to shift this a little bit. It's different than you see it on the slides. Leading themes will be modes of diversity correction in medical AI, the role of self-identified ethnicity in training data, and what other culture-specific input variables might help the AI's learning process. Observing these groups, their subsequent activities, and the developmental process of the algorithmic training will put us in a unique situation to examine the sociality of an AI in the making. This integrates both qualitative methods like participants' observation or focus groups and the programming practice with quantitative and digital approaches. In terms of open science and outreach, the project also aims to establish a visual atlas of medical AI inequalities in Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, as well as a comparative database on such issues. Okay, now we are coming full circle. Over the course of the last few minutes, I've shown algorithmic biases do not come by chance, but from the neutralization of epistemic and social diversity in computer science. This has narrowed the sociality of algorithms, leading to the need to implement mitigation strategies. However, by investigating the bias mitigation strategy of hospitals like Geneva's University Hospital and other European hospitals adopting AI cancer care strategies, an important contribution can be made to make the networked sociality of algorithms empirically visible. This kind of visibility is, in my eyes, important for the diversification of both personalized health infrastructures and the governance of digital practices in health and medicine, both on national and European levels. One last word to the health information that more and more of us share on privately funded, non-Europe-based social health networks like Patients Like Me, since I mentioned them in the abstract. To get insights into their data practices and coding systems has proven to be far more difficult than getting into touch with hospitals for me. I'm since 7 months, for example, in discussion with Patients Like Me for just getting basic information about the ways they use to structure and make sense out of the data they collect. This seems to me so far a blind spot for empirical insights into the data biases and thus also empirically based governance strategies for those actors. Thank you all for listening.